Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 908 for November 19th, 2021. Coming up in a few minutes.
I grew the grain. Now I'm helping to distill it. It's full circle. It's precious.
With just a handful of exceptions, the process for making whiskey at George Washington's distillery at Mount Vernon is much the same as it was when Washington was still alive. One of those exceptions has been the grain. While they're similar in many ways to their historic predecessors, the grain still comes out of today's modern commodity system that supplies most distilleries. Last weekend, a group of distillers, farmers, and whiskey lovers took the process back another step at Mount Vernon, distilling so-called heritage grains there for the first time. We'll have that story later on WhiskyCast In-Depth, along with the What I'm Tasting This Week department, your voice, behind the label, and...
I said, "No, you guys don't make rye by chance, do you?" And the reply I got was, "I'll call you tomorrow." and that's basically where it started.
The news is next on this week's WhiskyCast.
What do Japan and Scotland have in common? You guessed it, whiskey. That's why Dewar's brought these two cultures together in our newest cask series innovation, introducing Dewar's 8-year Japanese Smooth. We took the Dewar's you know and love and finished it in rare Mizunara oak casks for a complex and balanced Scotch whiskey like no other.
And now, a Thanksgiving message from Robin Redbreast.
What am I thankful for? Being on the smaller end of the bird scale.
Happy Thanksgiving from Redbreast, proud sponsor of WhiskyCast.
Let's get started with the news. This week's deal between Heineken and South Africa's Distell group will have a wide impact on the whiskey business. Heineken is buying majority control of Distell for $2.5 billion, along with Namibian breweries, in a bid to expand its presence in Africa. The deal will see Distell's South African wine and spirits portfolio come under Heineken management, including the James Sedgwick Distillery with its Baines and Cape Mountain whiskies. In essence, Distell is being split into two companies. The South African assets under Heineken control will be part of what's being called Newco. The second company is called Cape Van, and its largest asset will be the Distell Scotch whisky portfolio with Bunnahabhain, Deanston, and Tobermory distilleries. Distell's largest individual shareholder, South African billionaire Johan Rupert's Remgro Holding Company, will own around 65% of Cape Van, while Heineken will hold a 35% stake. Newco will continue to sell Cape Van's Scotch whiskies in South Africa. The deal must still receive regulatory approval, and South Africa's government pension fund also has to sign off on it, since the fund owns about 30% of Distell's stock. Elsewhere in global whiskey, Pernod Ricard has officially opened its new malt whiskey distillery in China. The $150 million Chuan distillery in Emishan is the first opened by a global spirits producer in China. It's expected to become a major tourist attraction when its visitors center opens in 2023. Scotch whisky producers escaped a tax hike in the UK government's budget for next year, but The Times reports a new tax hike could be coming much closer to home. The Scottish National Party's majority government in Edinburgh is considering ways to increase tax revenue for public services, and one of the ideas would see distillers hit with a water tax of up to £1 per bottle. That tax would be imposed on all whiskey production, both for domestic sales and exports, and it could raise as much as £1 billion per year. It'll be up for discussion at the SNP's annual party conference later this month. Under the UK's current system of devolved government, corporate taxation is managed by the UK government in London, But Scotland's government has some taxing authority that includes water taxes. As you might expect, there is opposition from unions representing whiskey industry workers, while the Scotch Whisky Association has yet to comment on the idea. In other news, the owner of the Scotch Malt Whisky Society is branching out. The artisanal spirits company has launched the J.G. Thompson & Company brand. Like the Society, it's an independent bottler, but its spirits will be available on the open market instead of being sold only to members. The first tranche of J.G. Thompson & Company releases includes 4 blended malts and a 1972 blended grain whiskey, along with a rum and a gin. Seattle's Westland Distillery is marking its 10th anniversary with a release that's a throwback to the past. Deacon's Seat was the very first Westland release back in 2013, 2 years after the distillery opened. And now there's a new Deacon's Seat limited edition to celebrate the anniversary. Westland co-founder Matt Hoffman explained the new whiskey during a Zoom event the other night.
When we were coming up with this idea, we said, okay, the Deacon's Seat, the liquid, let's make it about, just like the original Deacon's Seat, let's make it about the things that we're most excited about in the future. So we've got there's a local, wine cask in there. So, we're really excited about local, beer and wine cask, things like that. We've got the Alba variety that was used in Colare Edition 1 is in here, as well as Garaguelak and a couple of other things, just as a way to represent, the same spirit of the original Deacon's Seat is. This is the future that we're really excited about, as much as we could try to concentrate it into a few things here.
Only 400 bottles of the new Deacon's Seat were produced. Each one comes with a coffee table book on Westland's first 10 years. They're available only at the distillery's website. The price tag, $300 each. Baltimore's Sagamore Spirit is marking a milestone of its own, the first release of its own bottled-in-bond Maryland rye whiskey. Until now, all of the Sagamore Spirit releases, except for the pennies proof previews, have been based on rye whiskey sourced from MGP in Indiana. As Sagamore Spirit's Ryan Norwood told us the other night on the Happy Hour live webcast, this whiskey includes some of the first spirit ever distilled at Sagamore Spirit.
We're really excited because when we first started, we did our first batch of whiskey in April of 2017. And as we've gone through the tasting process and the evaluation, we're really, really happy with where this is. And we thought that one fun way to really bring people in is to release our first bottle in bond. So this is a 4 to 4.5 year old whiskey, all distilled and aged here in the state of Maryland by Sagamore Spirit at 100 proof.
It'll be available in limited amounts at the distillery in Baltimore and a handful of retailers around the country. I'll have tasting notes for it soon at the WhiskyCast website. And sticking with ryes for a bit, there's a new collaboration between the world's largest whiskey maker and one of the smallest. Diageo's George Dickel Tennessee Whiskey and Leopold Brothers in Denver teamed up for the new Collaboration Rye. It blends rye from the Leopold Brothers 3-chamber still in Denver with a very rare rye, Dickel's own column distilled rye from Cascade Hollow in Tennessee. In fact, that rye is so rare that few people outside of Cascade Hollow knew about it, much less Todd Leopold.
It was just a bit of a happy accident in the sense that we were preparing about a year out from releasing the 3-chamber rye, and part of the history of the 3-chamber still isn't just selling it on its own. It's to sell a portion of the 3-chamber and blend it together with column still. It was very common all the way back into the 1800s, and basically. Nicole was the very first phone call that I made, and it was a funny one, of course, because I didn't think that they had made any rye at Cascade Hollow, so it was a bit of an aside after I had sent her out a sample of the 3-chamber to kind of let her know, okay, the project's almost done here, and here's how it is. And I said, no, you guys don't make rye by chance, do you? And the reply I got was, I'll call you tomorrow. And that's basically where it started. And it's just been a really, really fun ride working on the blend. It's probably, I don't have to deal with as much red tape, although my brother can be a bit of a pain in the neck, and you have to get his green light as well.
When Todd called me up about an opportunity to, blend his 3-chamber rye, which I'm definitely going to let him describe because he does a better job, but to blend it with, my own rye whiskey from Cascade Hollow as a column distilled rye, that it was a collaboration that had a real purpose in resurrecting this historic style. So that was something that was really exciting for me. And it was an opportunity I couldn't pass up, no matter how difficult it was to get all the ducks in a row.
Nicole Austin and Todd Leopold were guests on the latest Happy Hour live webcast the other night. And what makes this collaboration even more unusual, their portraits both appear on the Collaboration Rye label. I'll have my tasting notes for it in just a few minutes. Here's another example of just how much interest there is in rye these days. Diageo's Johnny Walker has released a high rye blended Scotch whiskey. It's one of the final projects for retiring Johnny Walker master blender Jim Beveridge, and has 60% rye whiskey in the blend, along with single malts and a touch of wheat. It's bottled at 45% ABV and carries a recommended retail price in the U.S. of around $35 a bottle. I'll have tasting notes for it soon at the WhiskyCast website. Meanwhile, Irish Distillers has released the 4th edition of its Garaguelak single pot still Irish whiskey. This series highlights the importance of conserving Ireland's oak forests. The release was finished in virgin Irish oak casks made from 7 trees that were harvested sustainably from Kilebeg wood on the Ballykilcavan estate in County Lois. Each cask was made from a single tree. There are 7 different versions for the 7 different trees. They're bottled at around 56% ABV and will be available worldwide in limited amounts. The recommended retail price is €310 a bottle. That's around $350 U.S. at current exchange rates. And finally, hundreds of gallons of Jack Daniel's Tennessee whiskey were lost this week when an 18-wheeler overturned in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, Wednesday. Police say the driver was getting on to Interstate 24 when the $400,000 load of whiskey shifted and caused the trailer to flip over. According to the police, the whiskey was in containers bound for Nashville to be shipped on to Israel for bottling. There's only one word to say here: oy. You can keep up with the latest whiskey news all week long at whiskycast.com. If you missed last Friday's Happy Hour live webcast with our guests Brian Tracy and Ryan Norwood from Sagamore Spirit, Nicole Austin of Cascade Hollow, and George Dickel, and Todd Leopold of Leopold Brothers, the on-demand replay is available right now at the WhiskyCast YouTube channel. I am still trying to recover from the hashtag concussion from hell, and I've decided that it makes sense to focus exclusively on our weekly podcasts for now. So we are going to take a break from the live Friday night webcasts for the holidays, especially since both Christmas Eve and New Year's Eve fall on Friday this year. Our live webcasts will return in early January. In the meantime, you can watch webcasts you might have missed over the last year and a half or so at the WhiskyCast YouTube channel. Time now for the WhiskyCast calendar of events, brought to you by Catoctin Creek Distilling. Inter Whiskey 2021 is still on for next Friday through Sunday in Frankfurt, Germany, along with the York Whiskey Festival in York, England, and the Drambusters Whiskey Festival in Dumfries, Scotland next Saturday. The Stockholm Beer and Whiskey Festival returns on December 2nd through the 4th, along with the Christie's Auction of Rare Spirits and Wines in London on the 2nd and 3rd, the final McTeer's Whiskey Auction of the year on the 3rd in Glasgow, Scotland, and the Distillers Charity One of One Auction at Sotheby's in London on the 4th. Stranahan's Distillery brings back its annual Snowflake limited edition release party on the 4th, but this year it'll be at Red Rocks Amphitheater in Denver, Colorado, instead of at the distillery. And the National Whiskey Festival will be on December 11th in Edinburgh, Scotland. Remember, all in-person events are still subject to change on short notice, and you may have to show proof of vaccination or a recent negative COVID test in order to attend. The calendar of events is brought to you by Catoctin Creek Distilling, makers of the Virginia Rye whiskey. You'll find their Roundstone Rye at fine whiskey shops in 26 U.S. states, 3 continents, and online. Visit the new BuyVirginiaRye.com site for more details. And please drink responsibly.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
So, in Spain, they call Redbreast Petit Roco. It's me, but a touch more exotic. Kind of like a Redbreast PX edition. Finished in Pedro Jimenez casks, adding a velvety and decadent dimension. You know, I won't lie. A climate like this makes me wish I was a migratory bird.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by Oban and the Classic Malts lineup. For most farmers in North America, the harvest season is wrapping up. But for rye farmers, it's planting season. That's because rye goes into the ground in the autumn and grows slowly through the winter, then goes into high gear as springtime comes around. That's one of the characteristics that makes rye unique, along with the character it brings to a whiskey. But as with most other grains, modern-day ryes have become part of the commodity grain system, where bigger customers determine what strains of rye actually get planted, and the strains distillers might prefer for their flavor get left by the wayside over time. That's what happened with Rosen Rye, popular with Pennsylvania distillers for generations, but not popular enough for farmers to grow it profitably, dooming it to what's known today as heirloom status. Of course, heirlooms can still be cherished. Just like a vintage car, though, they might need a bit more care and attention. And that's exactly what Rosen Rye got earlier this month from a team of craft distillers who gathered at George Washington's distillery at Mount Vernon in Virginia to make some old-fashioned Rosen Rye whiskey.
Yeah, we go fast. Okay, start again.
George Washington's distillery is a recreation of the estate's original distillery. Back in 1798 and 1799, it was one of the largest distilleries in the United States at that time. And the distillers, free and enslaved men, did everything by hand.
Let's go fast on this 40. Yeah, let me get this in because otherwise we'll have rye flying out of the top of it for dinner.
They still do everything by hand today in making the modern-day version of George Washington's rye whiskey with wooden buckets for hauling water. Hand-cut firewood to heat up the stills, and hand-stirring the grain as the mash cooks. The only concession to technology the grains Mount Vernon's Steve Bayshore and his team normally use are modern-day hybrids.
We're using a yellow corn, and either Danko rye or a Abruzzi rye, and then a modern malt.
Because that's what's available to you, right?
Yes, sir. That's what's around, and that's what we've been doing over the years. But this being a historic distillery, it kind of fits for us to go into this area of heritage grains or heirloom grains. The whole point of this is to cook the grains, break down the starch within the grains.
Rosen Rye is one of those heirloom grains. It's not native to Virginia. It was grown mostly in Pennsylvania and helped cement the legacy of Pennsylvania rye whiskey and distillers like the late Dick Stoll. He was the last distiller to make whiskey with Rosen Rye at the original Michter's Distillery in Schaefferstown. And years after it closed, Dick Stoll made his comeback at Stoll and Wolf Distillery in Lidditz, Pennsylvania, before his death last year. On this Sunday morning, Eric Wolf is helping to stir the mash on a batch of Rosen Rye.
It definitely has unique flavor. I would say definitely unique fermentation as well in terms of the aromas. Definitely a little thicker, definitely a unique grain to work with. And for us, one that every time we mash or distill, can't help but feel a little bit of an extra connection with Dick, who for us, luckily, although we miss him and wish he were here with us today, continuing to produce and keep that legacy alive to us is the best way that we know to do so. So to be with these folks and continuing the Rosen, see it being done in such a historic distillery is just, for us, on a Sunday morning, it really is like going to church.
The Rosen Rye Revival had its start about 7 years ago. At the time, Laura Fields of the Delaware Valley Fields Foundation was doing research on Pennsylvania whiskies when she met with Dick Stoll and Eric Wolf.
They wanted to recreate the old mash bills that Dick was used to working with at Michter's in Schaefferstown, obviously. And he mentioned that he would have loved to be able to use Rosen Rye, which is what they were using. And I was like, well, what's the deal with that? How come you guys aren't using it? And he said, we just don't have access to it. There's none available. And I took that information along with all the other information I gathered from that particular trip and went home and started looking at, how do we go about finding this? Where is it? I thought I found something online that was happening out in Washington State. And then when I contacted them, they said they didn't have any. I started, talking to people in Canada and all around. And I finally discovered that at Penn State, that Greg Roth, who is with the agricultural extension at Penn State, had like a baggie of it because he had done a small experimentation, I think in a greenhouse, and grew a very, very small amount of it. And I said, well, oh my God, like you're the only person I've ever met that has any. So I immediately drove out to Penn State, I think the next week, and sat down with him when he had a moment to spare. And I was like, well, what are you doing with this grain? He goes, nothing. I was like, well, what do you mean? He goes, it was just an experiment, just something small. And I said, well, what are you talking about? He said, we're not going to do it anymore. So when I asked him what he needed, he said funding. And I said, done. I wrote him a check that day.
That was the genesis for the Foundation's Seed Spark program, which took that small baggie of seeds and planted a small strip of Rosen Rye. The following year, the seeds from that harvest planted 1.5 acres, and so on. 2 years ago, Robert McDonald of Dancing Star Farm switched his entire field from heirloom corn to Rosen Rye for the Seed Spark program.
It's harder to harvest. The Rosen Rye grows 6 foot tall compared to the hybrid rye that's only 3 foot tall. It takes longer to harvest it. It's just a whole different way of farming. It's the way it was done 50 years ago.
A lot more fun, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, it is fun. It gives you a feeling of accomplishment at the end of the day that you're helping to bring back things, that was your grandparents did. A different way of life, a slower paced life. I grew the grain. Now I'm helping to distill it. It's full circle. It's precious.
By 2019, there was enough Rosen Rye to free up some grain for distilling. Of course, that grain went to Stoll and Wolf.
Dick was the last person in Pennsylvania to distill Rosen Rye nearly 50 years ago, and then was the first to distill it once again once Laura and Greg and Robert McDonald had worked to propagate it back up. So for Dick to sort of bookend that, be the last guy to distill it and then the first guy to distill it upon its return, sort of gives it an extra special place in our heart. And it's something that for us, we're just thrilled to be a part of. So, yeah, it's just really an honor. So.
And your Rosen Rye is on the market now, right?
It is on the market. We look forward to hopefully having you try some later today. It's actually 2 years old. To our knowledge, the first aged Rosen Rye released in Pennsylvania in the last half century. So for us to help bring that back and to reintroduce that flavor profile to fellow Pennsylvanians and hopefully eventually some folks outside of the state is really just exciting and a labor of love and something we're just honored to be a part of. I mean, so often the farmers and the folks who are out actually growing the grain, doing all that backbreaking labor, don't get, they're not a face of a product or they're not getting the recognition of the final whiskeys.
There's an old saying, many hands make light work. The person who came up with that never worked in a colonial-era distillery. But craft distillers came in from around the country to help make this unique whiskey. Kim Carter Bard and her husband Tom came from Kentucky.
I have only seen things like this in pictures. This is just amazing. Going back to old school here.
Nothing like what you've got back in Kentucky, right?
Well, you might be surprised. We have 2 60-gallon pot stills that we use, and we do almost everything by hand as well. The only difference is we don't use buckets to fill ours. We do use a pump.
You're cheating.
Basically, yeah, we cheat just a little bit.
What brought you out here today? Why did you decide that this was so important that you guys made the trip out from Kentucky?
Well, Tom and I were able to come out and do a tour with Steve a few years ago after we had met at ACSA, the ACSA fly-in for FET reduction. We became fast friends, brought Tom up here to meet him. He gave us the grand tour of the grounds, brought us over to the distillery, of course, and we absolutely fell in love with it. My husband Tom is a history buff just like Steve is, so they really hit it off well. They both play guitar. I'm just kind of along for the ride when it comes to most of the history stuff. I learned from them quite a bit, and when we saw this operation, we knew that we had to come back and help. Yeah, this is beautiful, Eric, wherever Eric is.
Lisa Wicker of Brooklyn's Widow Jane Distillery is Mount Vernon's consulting distiller. So what's it like distilling this stuff after distilling the regular, conventional, modern grains at this distillery over the last few years?
Oh my gosh, it's been amazing. We've always, created some really great distillate, really good traditional rye distillate, and it's so interesting. It is always a little bit herbaceous. It's always a little bit, it's got that green that ends up translating into spice later. This is sweet like liquid sugar cubes, and it's so interesting that I had the good fortune to be at Stolen Wolf when the first time that they ran this rye, and we're getting the same characteristics here. It is so sweet and so good. It's a little bit floral, just a little bit fruity, and but not in an overpowering sort of way. And I cannot wait to see how it tastes in a few years from now, because it's remarkable white distillate. It's some of the best white distillate I've ever had.
And of course, it's not made that way anymore because this grain wasn't economical for distillers, right?
Correct. I know. Trying to get over that hump. I mean, it's something that we're all doing that are working with heirloom grains. You're looking at commodity grains versus grains that were grown specifically. All grains are commodity, but grains that were grown specifically for a particular type of whiskey, and trying to make those things economically viable for everyone, is ultimately the goal, that they're all in the mainstream. Not unlike organic produce in the grocery store, where it used to be completely untouchable, and now the organic have expanded because people have found better ways to grow those and better ways to get those to market. And so really we're looking at the exact same things with the heirloom grains.
Can you see a time when this is going to become mainstream again?
Yes, absolutely. There's no arguing with the flavor. I mean, not that we don't love whiskeys made from traditional commodity rye and commodity yellow dent, but I think it's just going to open up the world of whiskey even further. As people start to understand, there's nothing more fun than sitting with a group of friends and like breaking a whiskey down right on flavor and stuff like this. And we're just going to add more to that color palette with all of these.
Steve, all this rye is just a one bag Rosen, or is it all Rosen?
It's all Rosen.
It's all Rosen? Okay, so just bigger to smaller when you come back?
Yeah, we'll do the corn first, right?
Yeah, and then a bigger bag of rye.
They're all Rosen.
Okay, gotcha.
Before that can happen, more farmers will need to embrace the concept of heirloom grains, and Laura Fields has been persuading more of them to come on board, since Robert McDonald can't grow enough Rosen Rye by himself.
I always knew, that was going to be the place where we were always going to get our seed stock, but the whole idea is that we keep rosin in Pennsylvania and keep it growing all over Pennsylvania, benefiting farmers throughout the state. So, yes, the seed stock will be maintained at Bob's property, but farmers all over the state will begin growing it. And this is all part of our larger research project for the Seed Spark project. So you have a farmer in Lancaster County growing for specifically Stolen Wolf, because I knew that Bob wouldn't be able to, supply them forever. So Eric is working with a farmer local to him, the Klein family farm, and they'll be growing for him going forward. We have a new farmer this year up in Erie, Pennsylvania, because that's a totally different growing season up there with a totally different, soil quality. So they're going to be growing it with Altered State Distillery up there. Gettysburg Park, which is, hollowed ground, they'll be growing rosin for Mason-Dixon Distillery. And, this is the plan, I would love for rosin to be an integral part of Pennsylvania rye whiskey going forward. And all those distillers need access to it through local farming. And we'd love to see down the road if rosin ends up differentiating itself in these different areas. And, all the different whiskeys are made all these different ways, different stills, different mash bills, different everything.
Give me a sense of what this does for both the distillers and the farmers in Pennsylvania.
It returns, we're not reinventing the wheel here. This is something that was integral to the history of farmers in Pennsylvania. Distillers buy lots of grain. And if you are a farmer that's supplying to your local distiller, that's a beautiful cash crop for you that you can get a check right from the distiller. It basically returns us to where Pennsylvania was back before Prohibition. Prohibition didn't just affect the distillers, it affected our agricultural system. You see a lot of these farmers losing their land, mostly because, the largest use of land for a farmer is grain and grain production. You don't use 100 acres to grow tomatoes. You use 100 acres to grow corn or soy or rye. And it used to be that most of that land was utilized for growing rye. And so we'd love to be able to return to a place where Pennsylvania is the rye production center for the East Coast.
Okay, Mount Vernon isn't in Pennsylvania, but on this Sunday morning, in this place, it's just like Eric Wolf said, just like going to church.
We were joking with Steve that it takes a unique individual to take vacation from their work to go work at somebody else's job. And looking around this room, there's so many distillers that have done that. And I think for a lot of them, it just speaks to being able to physically work in such a historic environment. There's certain aspects of the history that until you physically do it, until you feel the heat of that steam, the heat of the open fire, smell that mash cooking in here, it just really brings the history to life. And there's certain aspects of it that you can't fully appreciate until you physically do them. And then to have that physical sense memory associated with the history, oh man, it's, again, for us, like going to hallowed ground, really. So just thankful to be here.
The Rosen Rye whiskey distilled at Mount Vernon also includes 2 other heirloom grains, an orange Creole corn and Bloody Butcher corn. It'll be matured on the Mount Vernon estate, and there is something equally unique about how it's being matured. We'll have that story later in our Behind the Label segment. Full disclosure, production support for this segment was provided by the Distilled Spirits Council of the United States. But as with all of our stories, full editorial control remains with WhiskyCast. That's WhiskyCast In-Depth, brought to you by Oban. Every sip of Oban is like a postcard from Scotland. Whether it's the classic Oban 14-year-old, the 18-year-old, Oban Little Bay, or the Distillers edition, every drop comes from the coastal town of Oban and a distillery just 206 steps away from the sea. It's one of Scotland's smallest distilleries, with just 7 people who make whiskey the same way their predecessors have since 1794. Find out more at obanwhiskey.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. I did get to taste the Stolen Wolf Rosen Rye a few days later at home. As Eric Wolf said, it's 2 years old and bottled at 45% ABV. The nose has notes of toasted rye bread, charred oak, caramel, brown sugar, molasses, dried apples, and a hint of pipe tobacco. The taste starts off sweet and floral for a brief time, before the baking spices come alive with an explosion of flavor. Then they fade slowly to reveal fruity touches of peaches, pears, and red apples. The finish is long, subtle, and complex. It's a very unique whiskey, and I'm scoring the Stoll & Wolf Rosen Rye a 92. I mentioned the collaboration rye whiskey from George Dickel and Leopold Brothers during the news, and had a chance to taste a sample of it. It's bottled at 50% ABV. The nose has a nice touch of dill, complemented by baking spices, charred oak, honey, and brown sugar. The taste has a smooth mouthfeel, with spices that build up slowly to a nice crescendo, then fade slowly as sweeter notes of honey and brown sugar come out, along with some oak and vanilla. The finish is very long, gentle, and well-balanced. I love collaboration projects like this. I'm scoring the George Dickel Leopold Brothers Collaboration Rye a 93. I'll have more tasting notes in just a minute, but first, this week's tasting notes are brought to you by Sagamore Spirit Rye Whiskey. They're reviving the tradition of Maryland-style rye at their Baltimore Farm and Waterfront Distillery. In-person tastings are available once again now at the distillery, but you can also find a variety of virtual tours and other experiences at the Sagamore Spirit website, and that includes a free virtual guided tasting for WhiskyCast listeners. When you buy bottles at your local retailer, a Sagamore Spirit teammate will guide you through each one. Visit SagamoreSpirit.com and use the code word WhiskyCast, all one word, to access them. Please drink responsibly. Another interesting collaboration brings together Ireland's Clonakilty Distillery with the folks at Catoctin Creek in Virginia. Clonakilty put some of its Irish whiskey into Catoctin Creek's 30-gallon rye whiskey quarter casks for a final maturation period, then bottled it at a whopping 62% ABV. The nose has a good balance of fruity and floral character, complemented by ginger, baking spices, honey, vanilla, and a hint of oak. The taste is spicy with cinnamon, clove, and ginger, touches of green apples, honey, and a hint of oak tannins. And the finish is long and spicy with a touch of fruity sweetness. It's a very complex whiskey, and I'm scoring the Clonakilty Catoctin Creek finish a 93. When it comes to complex whiskeys, the folks at Compass Box are hard to beat. The latest addition to their lineup is Orchard House, which blends malts known for a fruit-forward character. It's one of the first Compass Box whiskeys that uses mostly malt whiskeys that John Glazer and his team sourced as new make spirit years ago and matured in their own casks. It's bottled at 46% ABV. The nose has notes of fresh pears, apples, and peaches, balanced by touches of oak, honey, and butterscotch. The taste is full of baked apples, cinnamon, ginger, and hints of peaches, pears, black tea, honey, and oak tannins. The finish is long and well-balanced between lingering fruity notes and touches of spice. I'm scoring the Compass Box Orchard House Blended Malt a 94. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. I'll be adding these tasting notes to our searchable list of more than 3,200 whiskeys from all over the world. Check it out this week at whiskycast.com.
It's been 175 years and Dewar's continues to stay curious. We're proud to announce the newest addition to the innovative Dewar's 8-year cask-finished series of Scotch whiskey, Dewar's Japanese Smooth. Brought to life by our award-winning master blender, Stephanie McLeod, Japanese Smooth is a perfectly balanced 8-year-old Scotch whiskey that puts a pioneering and innovative focus on our aging process. After 8 years in Scotland, we blend, age again, then finish this whiskey in casks made from 200-year-old Mizunara oak trees. Rare? Sure, but worth it. The Mizunara oak perfectly complements the tasty notes with Dewar's Scotch whiskey. Japanese Smooth is loaded with Dewar's signature honey and floral notes, with the Japanese Mizunara oak adding exotic sweet and spicy flavors. Curious? Try this one in a perfect Japanese highball or on the rocks.
It's time to open up the inbox for Your Voice, presented by Scarabus, Islay Single Malt Scotch Whiskey. Let's go back to our story during the news about Heineken's deal to acquire Distell's South African wine and spirits portfolio. That includes the Baines and Cape Mountain whiskies from the James Sedgwick Distillery. I got this note from Tapiwa Carlton Chikwineri in Zimbabwe. My question as a consumer is, do we expect them to maintain the same quality of these established African brands, or do we expect a streamlining which will equal to mass production versus quality? Thanks. Well, Tapiwa, I think it's too soon to say. Keep in mind this is Heineken's first venture into the spirits business. There are big differences between the beer and spirits businesses, and Heineken's motivation is to expand its distribution and market share in Africa. That is what made Distell attractive for an acquisition. I suspect it's going to take Heineken some time to figure out how the Distell product range will integrate into its larger portfolio, and frankly, it would not surprise me at all if Baines and Cape Mountain and the James Sedgwick Distillery eventually wind up being sold back to Cape Van and reunited with the Scotch whiskey portfolio. Now, one of the things about the hashtag concussion from hell is that it seems to have affected my filter that normally lets me resist posting some of my more random thoughts on social media. For instance, I posted this one the other day. Whiskey makers are never allowed to express an age statement for their whiskeys in dog years. Well, apparently I'm not the only one with a slightly malfunctioning filter, though. Benjamin Reed at Ranger Rick on Twitter responded with this. On the other hand, it's a lot of fun to use proof and woof interchangeably. Which led to this tweet from @WoodenQuake, percent and pawcent. And this follow-up from Benjamin, 50 pawcent equals 100 woof. That's just science. No, that's just silly. And I can tell that even with half my brain tied behind my back. But it was good for a laugh, though. If there is something you'd like to share with whiskey lovers from all over the world, well, you can always find us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at WhiskyCast. The email address is comments@whiskycast.com. Your Voice is presented by Scarabus, the Islay single malt from Hunter Lang & Company that fuses craft and cask with time, sea, and air. Only those who seek shall find Scarabus. Start your search at hunterlang.com. Let's close out the show now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and people that make whiskey unique. It's brought to you by Writer's Tears. The Rosen Rye whiskey, distilled at George Washington's distillery at Mount Vernon this month, has not been put into barrels just yet. That's because it's destined for barrels just as unique as the whiskey. You see, George Washington died more than 200 years ago, but there are still a few trees on the Mount Vernon estate that date back to when Washington was still alive. That number has been declining over the years as time and the elements take their toll, but Mount Vernon's Steve Bayshore jumped on the chance to give one of those trees a second chance to be part of the estate's history.
Several years ago, I guess 3 years ago, a couple of large white oaks fell in a behind-the-scenes area that we know are Washington trees and would exist, been younger trees when he was alive. And I spoke with horticulture, and they let me have 2 large sections of one of the oaks. And so we hand-split that, and we air-dried it. It's over 3 years old, and it's now being coopered into some small barrels for us. So Marshall Sheets, the traditional cooper, he worked at Williamsburg for many years. He's independent now. His cooperage is called Jamestown Cooperage, so he makes barrels for a lot of museums, a lot of small operations. And he's got all the wood, and he's going to fashion those into barrels, and then we're going to toast and char them at Kelvin Cooperage in Kentucky in early December. Bring them back here and fill them at the end of December with some of what we're making right now.
And this really sort of is not something you've ever had a chance to do before with any of these trees, right?
Right. It's a rare opportunity because some other trees have fallen over the years, but they weren't as large or they were different species of tree. So being white oak, that's why I saw this happen, and my office is down in the area where these fell. So I thought, let me ask and see if they'd allow us to do that, and they agreed. So I'm looking forward to seeing what may happen in this older wood.
You didn't have anything to do with those trees falling, did you?
No, sir. The Mother Nature took care of that. So, we have some pretty good storms here occasionally, and sad they fell, but at least they're going to go to something really interesting.
Even the non-white oak trees have a use, though. The estate has a woodworker who turns pieces of those so-called Washington trees into pieces of art for sale at the Mount Vernon gift shop. As with the whiskey distilled at the estate, the proceeds go to support Mount Vernon's educational programs. If you have something you'd like us to look at on an upcoming episode, just use the contact form at whiskycast.com to get in touch with us. Behind the Label is brought to you by Writer's Tears.
Writer's Tears Copperpot. The tears of Ireland's great writers bursting with flavour, humour and angst. Bottled for you to taste. No writers were harmed in the making of this premium Irish whiskey. Writer's Tears Copperpot.
That's all for this edition of WhiskyCast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskycast.com. That's also where you'll find the latest whiskey news, my tasting notes, the calendar of events, the whiskey photo of the week, and, of course, a complete archive of all of our past episodes going all the way back to November of 2005. That's right, we are starting our 17th year of whiskey podcasting. Get in touch with us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskyCast. The email address is comments@whiskycast.com.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
Small batch. How would you describe it? It's like an Irishman's understanding of baseball. Extremely limited.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
Just like the end of this WhiskyCast episode, Dewar's Scotch whiskey always makes for a smooth finish. Like our newly released Dewar's Japanese Smooth, aged for 8 years in Scotland, blended then aged again before being finished for up to 6 months in Mizunara oak casks made from 200-year-old Japanese water oak trees. These unique casks layer distinct dry and spicy flavors to the whiskey, with aromas reminiscent of sandalwood and incense. Keep an eye out for a bottle of Dewar's Japanese Smooth at a store near you.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2021, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening, and please stay safe.